Welcome, everyone, to the second installment of the Fintech Talks series, hosted by Fintech Sandbox. I'm Fraser Anderson.
I'm Kelly Shaw
of Vestiga Ventures, and we're excited to introduce the Can You Actually Do Well by Doing Good session, a look into incentivizing VCs to invest in financial inclusion companies.
Money is a must for anyone participating in a society, and yet globally there are 1.7 billion unbanked. What I find most exciting is how digital advances have opened opportunities to better reach and service this market segment in a much more financially viable way. This has implications to lift millions globally out of poverty.
We've invested in some incredible businesses who help the financially vulnerable, including Cushion in the fee recovery space, Clerky in personal debt, and Kuru to help end credit rejection.
Tomorrow is our last day of Fintech Talks. Please join us for #RespectTheHustle, financial services for the growing gig economy at noon Eastern, and when 5G, edge computing, and Fintech collide, generating real data advantages for financial services at 3 p.m. Eastern. The registration link for these events are in the chat box now.
And with that, I'm so excited to welcome Nick Maynard from Commonwealth to get us started with the Can You Actually Do Well by Doing Good session. Hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thanks so much, Fraser and Kelly, for that great introduction. And I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this week for Fintech Talks, hosted by Fintech Sandbox. I'm Nick Maynard, Senior Vice President at Commonwealth. Commonwealth is a Boston-based national nonprofit organization that's focused on developing and scaling new financial product innovations that improve the financial security and opportunity of low to moderate income consumers. To achieve our mission, partnerships with major financial services firms like Voya, employers like UPS, and a variety of fintechs are foundational to our work. In our session today, we'll be talking with an incredible lineup of speakers about venture capital and funding for fintechs using the lens of increasing financial inclusion or financial access, as well as generating financial security for consumers. In today's discussion, we want to delve into 4 key areas using the financial inclusion and financial security lens. One area we'll look into is the impact of fintech products. Another is the role of non-traditional founders who want to have impact. Then we'll layer in a very focused conversation about venture capital and continue the conversation with observations about how the pandemic has further highlighted opportunities as well as challenges. We've prepared some questions for our conversation. We will work in questions from the audience as we can, and we should have time toward the end of our hour for Q&A from the audience. To submit your questions, please put them in the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen. There's also a chat box. Feel free to jump in there to introduce yourself, engage with each other, and comment on the panel's insights. But don't put your questions in the chat box because our panelists won't be able to see them. Be sure those go right in the Q&A box. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel. Joining us today is Jenny Abramson, and she is the founder and managing partner of Rethink Impact, the largest US-based impact-weighted venture capital firm with a gender lens that invests in female leaders using technology to solve the world's biggest problems. Also joining us today is Marcia Kong Rosado, and she is the Future of Finance Practice Lead at Village Capital. Village Capital has supported more seed stage impact-driven entrepreneurs than any other incubator or accelerator in the world. Marcia centers startups focused on financial health and economic opportunity for everyday people and small business owners in the US. She builds accelerator programs and networks of early stage investors, corporates, financial institutions, foundations, nonprofits, advocates, and community leaders. And I'd also like to welcome Tahira Dasani. As the managing director of Axion Venture Lab, global seed stage inclusive fintech investor, ALV is typically the first institutional capital into early stage startups that work to improve access, quality, and affordability of financial tools and products for the underserved. They combine their capital with active governance and deep sector and market expertise to provide strategic and operational support to their portfolio. Welcome to this great panel. So I want to start the conversation with a focus on fintech and product consumer impact. Tahira, the fintech ecosystem seems to deprioritize the financial access and financial security needs of low to moderate income consumers in the US. Solutions are not built with these consumers in mind first, and more often than not, solutions are less worse than current tools. How do you think about the financial inclusion and financial security outputs of fintech firms that you look to fund?
That's a great question, Nick. And, I think you're absolutely right? Most products, as traditional financial institutions build products, they aren't targeted towards low income customers. And that's historically been because those customers weren't very profitable, right? It was expensive to acquire them. And because they tended to carry smaller balances, transact with smaller volumes, et cetera, they didn't generate as much revenue. And so they haven't historically been targeted. But we are at a moment in time today where technology and innovation makes it possible to significantly transform the cost curve to acquire and serve these customers. And fintech startups that are leveraging that technology and innovation and have a strong particular focus on these niche segments can effectively and profitably serve these customers. And that's what we look for when we're investing. So we're looking for fintech startups that have a specific focus on an underserved customer, are leveraging technology and innovation in a way that enables them to acquire that customer and serve that customer effectively at a low cost that makes that customer profitable long-term for that startup. And the reality is that when you're thinking about these customers, their needs are different, because their income levels are different, their cash flows are different, the channels through which they're going to be acquired are different, the way products need to be priced to be relevant for them are different. And so it really does require a specific focus on those segments. It requires particular product design, channel strategy, pricing, et cetera, to be able to serve those customers effectively. So a niche focus on those customers with specific product design targeted to those customers, pricing and channel strategy targeted to those customers in a way that results in targeted, relevant quality products for those customers is what we're seeking to fund.
That's great. Marcia, similar question to you. How do you think about the fintech product impact question as you look at your work?
Awesome. And thank you to the Fintech Sandbox team for having us here today. And I would agree with several of the points that Tahira just mentioned around there being an opportunity to work with fintechs with specific focus on underserved customers, community bases, on product design, pricing, et cetera. To set some additional quick context setting, I think I'm going to answer this question from the perspective of our organization. So we're often creating and trying to identify startups for our accelerator programs, of which startups do receive funding at the end of the programs and are also considered by a separate financial health fund that we have with MetLife Foundation. So when we're considering startups, fintech startups, when we look at impact, there are a couple of key questions and conversations that we have in that process. So one is like, what will the impact of these fintech startups be for that customer base? And for the overall market that it seeks to operate in, are these impact outputs like baked and a core part of their business model, of their pricing strategy, or is this more of a nice to have or something that's trying to be forced in? And oftentimes, when we have conversations with fintech founders, we also assess how are they responding to these conversations we're having with them around impact? Is this something that they've started to think about? Is there intentionality there around the core business model? Have they started putting resources towards thinking about this? Is there a desire to look at this in the immediate or medium term, or is this something that is like much farther down the road? And we also look at a variety of fintechs with different business models, so B2B, B2C, B2B2C, and the key questions that are related on the product side is like, and on impact is, are these fintechs, like what's the impact that these fintechs, particularly for B2B, like what's the impact that they're having for either financial institutions or B2B organizations? And then what's the indirect impact for the end user for these solutions? So, and then something else, the last thing I'll say, and we can get to it later in this conversation, but as last year as the pandemic started and throughout, we also, of course, started having conversations on, okay, how are fintech founders either pivoting or thinking about the impact through COVID response, recovery, or resilience type of efforts?
That's great. Jenny, similar question to you to weigh in on how do you think about the end consumer impact as you approach working with fintechs and making investments? I'm not hearing your audio, Jenny. I don't know if others can, but I cannot hear your audio. Yes, you're there. There, I got you. Yep.
So at Rethink Impact, we're slightly later stage than some of the other panelists. We tend to invest in a Series A and B, often when companies have between $1 million and $10 million in ARR when we come in. And we look at this space, and particularly at companies where we think the greater the impact, the stronger the returns, and the two go hand in hand. And as it relates to financial inclusion, we approach this by thinking about the company's product or service, creating more affordable and accessible solutions. So those that, I'll give you an example, and we are thrilled to do it through B2B or B2C. I think a perfect example of this is a company we invested in called FutureFuel.io, which is sort of a fintech platform targeting the 44 million people in the US who collectively owe about $1.5 trillion in student debt. And so they sell to employers to offer student loan repayment and refinancing as a benefit to their employees, and in an effort to provide sort of ROI, employee retention, increased workforce diversity, productivity, and they also go direct to consumer. And so we believe that businesses like this are not only huge from an impact standpoint, but actually significant opportunities that have been untapped in many ways before. Similarly, we invest in a company, Icon Savings Plan, that gives alternative retirement savings solution for all workers, full-time, part-time, contractors, to help tackle the $28 trillion gap in retirement savings for Americans. So we really are believers that this choice people have set up of whether you can sort of do well and do good is somewhat of a false choice.
That's great. That's very exciting. I'm wondering, to any of you on this question of impact, is there any, before we move to the next sort of conversational topic, is there any area of consumers, especially financially vulnerable consumers, those looking for access or security, that you have found to be a particular challenge to find fintech models that can effectively serve? Any particular need, or ones that you have identified that you would put at the top, that maybe the converse, if it's hard to find the one that's not working well, are there ones that you really are like, this is a ripe opportunity that's just trending now?
I mean, I'm happy to kick us off. There is one consumer segment. So we've through different initiatives with PayPal and MetLife Foundation have been able to find and work with fintech solutions focused on a couple of segments, like different Black, Latinx consumer segments. And there's one that, I'll be honest, that as I think about future initiatives that we have to do more work around, right? There's a lot of conversations around BIPOC, but on our end, we're still struggling to work with founders that do center in, for example, Indigenous consumers and users. And I'm trying to, as we look at future programming, if we are using the term BIPOC, like the I in that term, making sure that we are actively recruiting and thinking about who are those Indigenous community leaders that we should be bringing to the table and better centering them. So that's one segment that came to mind.
And maybe just to jump in there, so beyond the some of the racial segments that Marcia just talked about, I think it's important to think about, underserved segments like smallholder farmers in emerging markets that historically have not been served at all, to think about refugee and immigrant populations in so many markets, IDPs, et cetera. Those are ones where we are starting to see more tailored solutions to migrant workers, to refugees, to smallholder farmers. And it's been really heartening to see the emergence of more models that are targeting those segments specifically.
Great. As we transition to the next part of our conversation, I just want to remind folks, if you have a question for the panel as we go through, and I'll keep sharing this reminder throughout, please put that into the Q&A box so we can work that into the conversation. So I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to some observations that Commonwealth has of the fintech field, that female founders and founders of color are oftentimes focused on this topic of generating impact around financial inclusion and financial security, but they find the entrepreneurial environment and the funding environment quite difficult. So Marcia, starting with you, how do you think about that opportunity there and the challenge for female founders and founders of color?
Sure. So from my point of view, plain and simple, huge opportunity, and in my opinion, responsibility for the fintech community. So thinking about accelerators, thinking about investors, about corporates looking at startup innovation to be supporting fintech founders, and fintech founders, across geographies, race, ethnicity, gender, ability, and additional backgrounds. There's many studies and articles that talk about the business potential of this. I'm not going to spend my time talking about it because or going into that piece, because truthfully, these things can be Googled and it's out there at this point. But what I will focus my energy on is sharing the growing movements that I'm seeing that are out there to uplift and ultimately fund diverse and representative fintech founders. So one of those movements is coming from emerging fund managers who are coming from these overlooked backgrounds and who are either seek to invest in fintech verticals and or broadly are sector agnostic, but seek to invest in founders from overlooked backgrounds. And there's a great blog post that I'll shout out by Cheryl Campos, where she talks about who some of these emerging fund managers are. There's also movements, to support and back these emerging fund managers, where entities like PayPal, Bank of America, and other organizations have made commitments and have been deploying dollars towards these funds. And then there's another movement, and maybe we could get to it later in this conversation, coming from alternative capital movements like crowdfunding and other fundraising tools with recent legislation changes that can hopefully uplift founders from everyday communities and including fintech founders. When I think of how could we better generate outcomes around race and gender equity among fintech founders, I think we need to continue to hold ourselves accountable as a community. And so there is one aspect of this for fintech accelerators and incubators. For example, I think we play a major role in uplifting diverse fintech founders, and there's an opportunity to examine and to continue to think about, okay, as we create programs or programming, not just saying I've sourced diverse startups led by people with direct lived experience, check, but actually taking it the next level and thinking more deeply about, okay, what are the power dynamics of every aspect of operating an accelerator program that I'm putting together? So thinking about, who are all the stakeholders, from mentors to other resources and leaders being brought in to support and join and uplift startups, fintech startups, and do they reflect the communities that these fintech startups were trying to serve? So, and for investors, of course, the big thing there is ultimately deploying more dollars towards diverse founders. And the last thing I'll say, I continue to ask the hard questions when I look at some investors and say, I look at the highest decision makers and say, okay, some work needs to be done there. And making sure that it's not just elite people from elite backgrounds that get to invest in fintech founders.
I like that. It sounds like a project, like a gut rehab is needed of the process, and really looking at it from a beginning with a new architecture. Jenny, what would your thoughts be on this topic and non-traditional founders, given the focus of your work?
Sure. Yes, we think it's a huge opportunity. Recent PitchBook data showed that investments, if you just take women as an example, of women-led companies are at rates as low as we've seen since 2017. We had been seeing progress. COVID really set us back, despite the fact that overall VC investments have stayed on par with previous years. And yet, what we're seeing in companies led by women, led by people of color, is diversity drives better returns. On average, female-led companies exit faster, about a year faster, and we know time is money in the venture world. They have 10% higher revenue, are more capital efficient, have higher valuation increases, and the stats are true for diverse teams. Companies with more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue, according to BCG. So to us, investing in female-led and diverse teams isn't just about inclusion, not to minimize inclusion. It is about helping, the VC industry be more successful financially. And I think, as you've heard already today, one of the things that we've seen in the VC industry is that you need diversity in jobs like ours, because who is sitting holding the purse strings and making those decisions impacts who gets the dollars. An IFC report showed that female partners, for example, are twice as likely to invest in female entrepreneurs as male partners. And so until we get diversity at the investment level, the fund level, it will be hard to change the numbers at the company level.
And Jenny, do you see, just to follow up on that point, sure. Do you see that any particular additional work that needs to be done around women of color, given especially the racial wealth gap, and how, like in Boston, in this ecosystem, it's often talked about the Federal Reserve data and the amount of financial assets are $8 for a black household and north of $100,000 to $200,000 for white households. So even starting out there, for looking for funding, there's that disparity. Do you think about women of color in any particular additional way?
Yeah, I think everything I'm sharing is even more true, which is women of color are, absolutely an untapped entrepreneurial segment. The fact that you can count in one article how many women of color have raised, $1 million or more is appalling, and frankly, a huge opportunity, a huge financial opportunity. So I think there are a number of things that need to happen, both at every level. At the LP level, sort of who's backing funds, I think there needs to be more and more demand for diversity at the fund manager level, which I think is coming, and we're seeing this. I think at the fund level, there has to be more and more of an effort to ensure pipelines are diverse. And then obviously at the accelerator level, there have to be more and more programs to support all entrepreneurs to be successful. And I think not only will that be good for diversity, not only will it be good from an economic standpoint, but there are huge problems that we need to tackle connected to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that really entrepreneurs who haven't experienced certain problems are going to be much less able to tackle and understand and see. And so we think there are large addressable market opportunities that are being missed and therefore really big businesses.
That's great. And Tahira, just to build off that, what do you think has to happen beyond what you've already heard to really address some of these issues of racial and gender equity in the sort of and support founders who bring that unique perspective and want to tackle some of the product challenges we talked about at the start.
Yeah, so building on what Jenny shared in terms of, having a diverse team as a venture fund improves the nature and the diversity mix of the entrepreneurs that are being invested in. Just to provide a little bit more nuance there, I think it's important not just to have women on the team, but to have women in senior roles on the team and investment roles on the team. So the research shows that having a female founding partner actually leads to far more women on the team, and that in turn leads to more representation of female founders in pipeline and actually getting investment. And then, beyond the venture fund level and the company founder level, I think there's also a few other levels that it's important to consider. So boards of directors. Once a venture fund invests, who's sitting on the board, who's helping steer the direction of the business. And then at the company level, not just looking at who the founder is, but looking at the mix across the organization. So definitely at the founder level, but then at the senior management level, as well as looking at the full employee base of that company. And then another thing that we think about is once we invest, how can we use our influence as an investor, our role in governance, as well as any post-investment support that we provide to actually help the company think about what they can put in place to attract more female employees, to think about how their products can better reach underserved female consumers as well. So, thinking about enabling policies that companies can put in place to enable more gender diversity within the organization, as well as things that they can do from a marketing perspective, a channel perspective, et cetera, to reach female and other underrepresented consumers. So, I completely agree with the points the other panelists have made, but I think we can look at more and more granular levels to think about diversity overall.
That's great. And so I think it's a good time to weave in an audience question that seems pertinent to the conversation here. And feel free to, whoever wants to jump in. What do GPs hear from LPs about diversity and about financial inclusion? Are LPs pressing for more progress on the racial and gender equity front and the consumer impact front?
I'm happy to start, and then others can jump in, but I think LPs have a really important role to play here. I think LPs can be really instrumental in terms of demanding more diversity at the GP level. I will say to date, we have seen some of our LPs starting to ask questions about the gender makeup of the team, the racial makeup of the team, et cetera, but we haven't yet seen LPs pushing it, requiring it, saying that they're actually going to put their money only on in teams that actually have that representation and that diversity. So I think we're starting to see LPs ask about it, but there's a lot more that can be done on that front to actually direct the flow of capital according to some of these principles.
That's great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that particular question?
Yeah,
I think
what's hard for LPs is they're sitting in a tough spot, which is they often have dollars with existing relationships that haven't done anything wrong, that are doing really well. And there's only risk for them in their minds often when they think about moving those dollars to someone without a track record from someone who has a successful track record. So I think what we need to think about at an institutional level at some of these larger LPs is figuring out a way to either add capital or create a way to get people who have no real incentive to shift capital from those that they have great relationships with to something new. We have to figure out a way to do that. And whether that's some sort of pledge, whether that is, pushing boards to push their investment teams to do that, I think that's going to be a key piece, because it's not that I think everyone's a bad actor. I think this is just a very tough dynamic from an incentive standpoint from those who are really sitting in the decision-making roles within LPs.
And then to build on, I would agree with what both Jenny and Hira just said, what I'll share isn't necessarily from the LP standpoint, but more of something that I think will help to drive more dollars into diverse fintech founders. There's a movement being led by Alejandro Guerrero from Act One Ventures around a diversity rider where founders and investors too can help to set the conversation, in particular funding rounds around, hey, X percentage, we want this to be coming from, let's say, like Latinx investors for this round. And there was actually a fintech company, Finix, who also created an SPV to allocate, where they allocated a certain percentage for it to come from, diverse investors. So there's other movements and I think other ways to help, drive these conversations and to drive more dollars towards diverse founders, and also like who gets to help make those investment decisions.
That's great. So layering in now to the third sort of layer of our conversation, the real focusing in here around venture capital as we've started to really talk about it. Jenny, I want to turn to you, and as you think about this conversation, maybe sort of the existential starting point is venture capital the right way to fund fintech startups that want to work on inclusion, access, and financial security?
It's a great question. I think that venture capital gets a lot of press, and as a result, entrepreneurs always assume that this is sort of the only path. And I would say I wouldn't eliminate venture capital, because I think there are fantastic businesses out there that are about inclusion, whether it's Future Fuel that I talked about, or Icon Savings, or Ellevest, or so many others. Who can get the kinds of returns, but it's not the only type. And I think there really needs to be much more press and much more, many more resources out there telling entrepreneurs about the other forms of capital. And debt often can be in an entrepreneur's most interest. Maybe there isn't hockey stick style growth. Family offices are becoming a much bigger player in tackling some of these issues. Grants, individuals. So there are so many other ways. And I think it's important to look back and figure out, what are your growth goals? What's the time period you want to do this? How do you do it most effectively? And what's the right capital behind that? If you're not on a path to get to 100 million in revenue in, 5 to 7 years, and that's not, or you don't want to pursue an exit, venture capital obviously needs to return capital within a certain period of time. You may not be the right fit for venture capital dollars, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of impact. So I guess I would say, yes, it can be venture capital, but it doesn't have to be.
Tahira, what do you think about that existential question?
So what I would say is completely agree with Jenny that there are many, many paths to bringing in capital, even revenue-based funding, et cetera, that don't have to look like traditional venture. But I will also say that in a lot of ways, I do think venture can be really well suited to addressing these types of models, because when we're talking about underserved populations, both in the US as well as in emerging markets, especially in emerging markets around the world, these are large customer segments that are underserved. And when we're thinking about the use of technology to drive solutions, we're looking at disruptive, innovative solutions that actually do lend themselves really well to venture funding. Now, that venture funding may need to look a little bit different than traditional Silicon Valley venture funding. It may need to be a little bit more patient. We may need longer fund lives. We may need to think about different approaches to portfolio construction. It may not simply be a let's focus on driving user numbers up. It may need to focus on a more sustainable path to growth and driving better unit economics, better revenue and profitability along the journey. But I do think the venture model can be really well suited, and agree it's not the only solution.
Marcia, what do you think of what you've heard so far in this existential question?
Yeah. I agree with both panelists. I think there needs to be more or continued conversations on the different types of ways to fundraise. I agree. Like, even when I think about the founders that we work with, we haven't excluded venture capital because it continues to be an important driver. But we are trying to, bring more education and awareness around tools like crowdfunding and see that continuing to grow alongside with venture capital, where founders can now, and there's better information, online about this, but founders will be able to raise up to 5 million, where before I think it was like 1.07 million. So that changes things a bit. And I agree, there are movements being led by Zebras Unite around alternative capital that encourage, if there are founders even listening to this today, to look at, and that organization has been driving the conversation on like revenue-based financing, revenue share, like the need for, if you're not a 10x business, but 3 to 4x, like what does that mean for you? What role do you have in our economy? So as I think of fintech founders, debt, revenue share, venture capital, like I don't think we need to exclude any type. I think where we need to go is just expanding the conversation and awareness around them.
So a question from the audience came in that might be relevant at this point. As you think about investments that you all make, what are the metrics that you, and these questions of inclusion and access and security, what metrics do you put around your investments to those outcomes to measure impact? And do you have models for doing that? And how do you incorporate it without it being, I would assume, overly burdensome to the work?
For us, it changes a lot based on the type of company and what it's tackling. So in a case like Future Fuel, just since I use that example where it's tackling student debt, we might look at how much debt is being reduced, how much more quickly are people able to pay off their debt. Who is this touching? We have a company, Winnie, which is tackling the childcare crisis, which is a massive issue, disproportionately affecting women, people of color. And in their case, we might look down to the zip code level to figure out who is being served from a demographic standpoint, and what's the average household income in the areas of their users. So are they helping people who most need childcare get matched with providers? And so it really can vary based on the company. We set individual KPIs that we track on a semi-annual basis to really look and figure out who's being served. And we look at it obviously on the front end of the investment, but also continue to look at it through the life of the company.
We have a very similar approach where when we make an investment, we build an impact thesis. We identify with the entrepreneur what metrics, what KPIs it makes sense to track for that business. But overall, we're trying to understand, is the customer a low income or underserved or low income customer, small business, or other underserved consumer that we're targeting? We're trying to understand how the product is serving the customer and ensuring that the product is delivering quality. So again, the specifics are going to vary based on the business, but we're thinking about, looking at pricing, our interest rates trending down over time, et cetera. We're looking at reach, how many customers are being served effectively. And then, Nick, you said, how do we make sure this isn't too onerous for the companies? And I think when we're focused on these metrics, they're important to understand impact. And that's important for us as an impact investor, but these are also metrics that are core operational metrics for the companies, for them to be thinking about the quality of the product, because that directly affects customer satisfaction, NPS, repeat usage, churn, et cetera. So, when we're identifying these impact metrics, it's not that the impact metrics can stand alone in a vacuum. These are core operational metrics that the business should be tracking anyways.
Marcia, anything to add there?
There's nothing that I'm going to say that's wildly different. I agree with what they both said. I think when I think about the fintech founders that we've worked with and who have gone through our programs, absolutely agree. Like we have an investment analyst who will look through their financial, model and think through, okay, like what are the assumptions that you have around pricing and scale and growth for your business, and what type of impact metrics would make sense based on the goals that you have around those areas. And so we do customize it to every company. I think a question that we're thinking through right now is there are impact tools out there, from the Global Impact Investing Network to Financial Health Network. And what's a better way to like systematize? I don't want to say standardized, because I agree, it has to be customized for every company, but what is a better way to know about the world of these tools and better ways to leverage them when reasonable?
Yeah, that's great. I like the idea of metrics that are consistent but flexible, and the direction that can give in terms of this inclusion and access and security challenge. Before we sort of shift a little to sort of what the pandemic has highlighted, I want this panel to be even more popular than it already is, and talk about an audience question around AI, because everybody loves AI. I don't think we're going to talk about blockchain. So, hashtag blockchain, hashtag AI. Get your Twitter accounts ready to capture these responses. But do you think that AI, in the work that you've seen, will it better enable inclusion and access and build financial security? Or do you think it'll hard code in existing biases and place that into a black box that we're not going to be able to really see or react to? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about that audience question.
I think the answer is it depends. I think it depends on how it's set up and how it's built and what are the intentions. I think it can be an incredible tool for good. We've seen it used in our mental health company, Spring Health. We've seen it used in lots of companies. And it can also be a tool that, if not very purposeful on this front, can backfire as it relates to these issues. So I think it really depends on the intentionality around it and the measuring of the data around it to ensure that you're keeping it in check.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Go for it.
I was just going to say that the AI is only as good as the people building the AI and the intentionality of it. And so, you have to be really cognizant about not, as you said, Nick, hard coding in biases, either implicit or explicit. That has to be something that's constantly watched for. But there is tremendous power in machine learning in using AI to, build better algorithms that can help underwrite customers that haven't historically been able to be included, that are able to leverage newly digitized forms of data effectively. So a lot of potential, but with great power comes great responsibility.
That's great. Marcy, anything to add there? Or that was a great summation, great power, great responsibility. I do get a little worried about with the consumers we're talking about and some of the work that we've done, the data feeds and how good the data is in terms of the full financial picture for some of the financial challenges. So I think we still have a lot of work to do there in terms of improving what the data that goes into, whether it's a machine learning algorithm or predictive analytics. And I think there's a lot more to be written in terms of an LMI, a low to moderate income U.S. consumer first, when thinking about applying some of these tools and doing a lot of learning before potentially causing harm. And that doesn't even get to the consumer trust issues that might be inherent in sort of, who's giving me this advice? Who's behind the curtain? So I think there's a lot to be learned there. So shifting gears a bit to the pandemic and speaking about a lot to learn, are there any in the conversation we've had so far, are there any opportunities or challenges you really think have been highlighted even further, or new ones that have opened up due to the pandemic? And I'll start with you, Tahira.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is that while COVID has affected everyone globally, it has had a disproportionate impact on people who are low income, on micro entrepreneurs and small business owners. And those are the target populations that our portfolio companies are trying to reach. The other reality is that, we're investing in seed stage startups. They are also small businesses, and they themselves have had to make significant operational changes, rethink how they acquire and engage with their customers. So it hasn't been an easy year for our portfolios. That said, there also has been a lot of opportunity that has been presented as a result of the fact that COVID has driven increased digital adoption. And we have so many consumers globally getting much more comfortable with digital services, using digital services for the first time because they've been forced to in a world that is lower touch. And that has created a lot of opportunity because it enables fintech providers to be able to play on those digital rails, use that digital infrastructure that exists. And it's also created opportunity for fintech startups to build and deliver new products and services that are targeted towards the specific needs of customers at this time. And so while no doubt it has provided a lot of challenges, we've seen real opportunity. We've seen entrepreneurs, companies in our portfolio really rise to the challenge and be able to deliver even more relevant products to their customers in this moment.
Marcia, what have you noticed in terms of the things that you're more focused on due to the pandemic?
Sure, and to build from Tahira's points, like founders have, I just want to say they're incredible people. A lot of respect to them, particularly during the pandemic and in general. For the fintech founders that we've worked with, we saw similar trends too. Just them trying to navigate a world where they have to make different, whether it's talent decisions or partnerships decisions, to better serve or reach consumers, or product pivots. We have several examples of that. And at the end of the day, I do think that the pandemic highlighted the importance of fintech solutions being focused on everyday people and business owners at large. As I think about this year and the future, we will continue to pay attention and to center fintech startups addressing key inequities around income inequality, home ownership, areas like student debt, continue to look at that, savings, retirement, and the racial wealth gap. And there's a couple of particular areas that we're trying to learn more about. We saw a lot of activity last year around certain nexus. So like the fintech housing nexus, knowing that around us, a lot of people have been struggling to meet rent or to keep their homes, right? And so curious about what the life cycle of fintech solutions across home ownership, from even when you're not ready for a home or that seems far away, to preparing to purchase one, to financing one, to maintaining one. That's one area. And then this isn't an area that our team, hasn't said we're explicitly looking at, but I am very curious to learn more about. And that area is around climate fintech. New Energy Nexus had done a report on this a couple months ago, and recognizing the global movements and even within the U.S. around this area. I know that we'll have to pay more attention to this, not just from a risk mitigation standpoint. And that's something that I don't have deep expertise on, but I would like to continue to learn more about.
And Jenny, how about in your work? What have you seen or where are you focusing as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think three really interesting things. So one, I think the pandemic has shown us that the areas we've been investing in, more accessible healthcare, innovative ed tech, quality mental health treatment, environmental solutions, and tools that empower people to move up the economic ladder. that all of these are very interrelated, and all of them in many ways have elements of them that have to do with economic empowerment and fintech, and they're more needed than ever. That COVID has just exacerbated the problems we have, and by doing so has actually made these business opportunities even bigger. So I think that's sort of the first learning. I think the second thing is that many investors have gone very insular, have gone to people they already knew, or at least did at first. And we have tried at Rethink Impact. We do office hours. We put them on our website. I'm on Twitter at Abramson Jenny. We're at Rethink Impact. We are trying to really change the dynamic. And I would say a good thing that's come from COVID, as my fellow panelists have said, is that it has taught people to be digital first. And so entrepreneurs who before couldn't access a VC in the Valley or in New York or a hot VC now actually can get access because everyone's learned to use Zoom. Everyone has learned that you can have conversations and you can invest in entrepreneurs you didn't already know, and you can get to know them online. And I think that is going to empower a whole new generation of entrepreneurs to get capital who couldn't get capital before. So to me, that's my hope coming out of COVID, is that there will be an opening up of the ecosystem that never could have happened. So we are just incredibly excited. We look at about 1,000 companies a year. We're thrilled to keep looking at more. And we actually are seeing more people we wouldn't have met because of the changes that have come from COVID. So that's I guess, what I would add to the conversation on that.
That's great. And I want to transition sort of, but build off of this conversation into the sort of, I guess, official Q&A period with our 5 minutes left here, with a question about, one thing that's obviously come out of COVID is on March 11th, this huge stimulus package, and a lot of money is going to flow to the communities we're talking about. And a lot of these communities, that money ends up, haircuts get taken out of it throughout the financial services system. Is any of your work focused on trying to address that? How are you thinking about that? Are you looking for impact in that particular area so that the more of the money is put to work in good ways for folks that need it, and less is sort of pocketed through the system's inefficiencies today? Or is it too early? Did I stump the band? Is it too early to know how that'll play out?
Yeah, I'll say that we don't have portfolio companies that are specifically targeting that issue, but I think a lot of our portfolio companies really seek to not just deliver products and services, but build financial education, financial capabilities to help customers get to a financially healthier place. And so hopefully those efforts can help customers think about how to use, some of the capital that's flowing their way in ways that are most relevant for their needs.
Great. So another question that came in from the audience, can corporate venture capitals play a differentiated role in supporting the objectives we're talking about? How about corporate innovation groups? Anyone have any thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I actually think they can play a pretty significant role. We've invested with a number of corporate VCs, Salesforce Ventures, a number of others who have impact arms, who care about these issues, and who can not only provide capital, but can provide a lot of credibility by being a customer early on or a partner early on that can help be the difference of whether some of these companies really take it to the next level. So I think they have a pretty critical role to play and are able sometimes to adjust their investment thesis in a more nimble way that sometimes venture capital funds that set up something and 10 years later sort of have to keep living that same fund thesis. I think they could be more nimble if the leaders in those companies are open and willing to adjust as the market needs it.
And I would, if I could jump in, I would agree with what Jenny just said. I think whether it's corporate venture arms, impact units, or innovation units at corporates, what we've seen is they can play, yes, of course, in addition to capital, that they can play an important role in terms of feedback and support around particular areas, such as whether it's sales, customer acquisition, product, and helping companies with feedback around these areas and in other type of challenge areas, and in helping them companies to mature, and also like Jenny said, to build reputation, whether it's with other investors or, maybe being the first major institution to pilot something and being like a test point for other institutions to come on board. So I would agree.
Yeah, and then our final question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, agreeing with the points that Jenny and Marcia made, the only thing I would add is that in addition to their role as partners, customers, and direct investors, we also have corporate venture arms that are LPs in our fund. And so they can also choose to support funds that are targeting these customers where there's strategic alignment.
That's super. And our last question here before we wrap up from the audience, what guidance are you giving your entrepreneurs regarding solving the trust gap in underserved communities with fintech, and how are you approaching that?
I think, what we're finding is that our entrepreneurs are coming at this in an incredibly authentic way, whether it's from personal experience or having spent time in the community. And therefore, there isn't as much of a trust gap, because I think they're doing it for the right reasons and building a company with the end user in mind from day one, and as part of the product development and everything else. So I guess I would say, to me, it's about authenticity, and it's about being, having the impact being core to what you're doing, and ultimately seeing that as a good business opportunity.
And I would say that, the lack of trust often comes from a situation where the product isn't targeted to and tailored to those customers. And in order to do that, you have to know them and understand their needs. And so continuing to really encourage entrepreneurs to keep that very customer-centric lens in everything that they do, to design with customer needs in mind, every element of the product and the delivery of the product, the pricing, et cetera, that can really help.
Yeah, and I would just add one quick thing on that. I think of a great example of Elevest, which is Sally Krawcheck's company, which is solving the investment gap for women. If you spend time looking at her site and what they've done, you just see a level of authenticity and putting the customer first in every part of the approach. And I think as long as CEOs can do that and teams can do that, they will be incredibly successful.
And then the last thing I'll add, and agree with the points said by the panelists, is in addition to authenticity, having direct lived experience with, the problems that the startup seeks to solve. The other thing too is just being transparent with consumers and real about, like, hey, we recognize whether it's this inequity or this situation has happened. This is our direct lived experience, and we're designing it from that lens, and here's where we want to go. Like, I think being real and transparent is something that certain segments of consumers are appreciating, and bringing them through that journey can be helpful.
That's great. Well, we're up against time, and I just want to say a hearty thank you to all of you for this great conversation. It's just been a lot of great digging into a really important topic, and I've learned a tremendous amount. So thank you for your participation and for your insights. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for listening in. The next FinTech Talk event will be tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern for #RespectTheHustle, Financial Services for the Gig Economy. If you're not already signed up, you can register on the event page. The link is in the chat, and I hope you'll be able to join us. Also, be sure to mark your calendars for Boston FinTech Week, which is coming September 28th through October 1st. The FinTech Sandbox team is excited to bring the FinTech community together for that event. More details to come soon. So goodbye, everyone, and thanks again to this awesome panel. Take care.